Most people, when they think of Berlin in World War II, picture the end. The bunkers, the rubble, the black and white footage of a city reduced to dust. They picture 1945. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. By 1939, the war had already been going on for years. Not in the trenches, not yet, but in the streets, in the laws, in the faces of people who had disappeared from neighborhoods almost overnight, in the jazz clubs that stopped playing the wrong kind of music, in the books that vanished from the shelves without anyone officially announcing they were gone. Most of history treats 1939 as the beginning, the invasion of Poland, the declaration of war, the starting gun. But if you were living in Berlin, if you were one of the 4 million people going about your life in this city, 1939 didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like something that had already been going on for a long time, quietly, beneath the surface, and was now simply becoming impossible to ignore. And yet, the bakeries were open, the trams were running, children were walking to school. A man at a cafe was folding his newspaper, sipping his coffee, completely unbothered. The city had a rhythm, a comfortable, almost willful rhythm, and that rhythm was, by then, the most extraordinary thing about it. In this video, I use modern AI tools to reconstruct the streets, the buildings, and the daily life of Berlin in 1939. Not the Berlin of bombs and bunkers, not the Berlin of the final collapse, but the Berlin that existed in the strange, suspended tension of a city that was already at war with itself, and still, somehow, going to work on Monday morning. The goal isn't just to see the history, it's to feel the cobblestones under your feet, to hear the noise of a city that knew something was wrong and had chosen, for reasons that are very human and very uncomfortable, to keep going anyway. If you could stand on a corner in Charlottenburg in the summer of 1939, what you would feel, before anything else, is how normal it all looked. And that normality, that stubborn, fragile, deeply unsettling normality, is the real story of this city. And it's nothing like what you've been told. Before the rubble, there was this, a metropolis, one of the largest cities in the world, bigger than Paris at the time, with a subway network that was the envy of Europe. 75 stations, trains every 3 minutes at peak hour. Department stores on Tauentzienstraße that could rival anything in London or New York. A university that had produced more Nobel Prize winners than most countries. A cafe culture so rich, so layered, that writers and artists had been arguing in its back rooms for decades. This was the Berlin that the world knew before 1933. And in 1939, traces of it were still everywhere, if you knew where to look. But to understand the city you're about to walk through, you first have to understand what it had already survived. Because Berlin in 1939 wasn't just any city. It was a city that had been broken and rebuilt so many times that resilience had become almost indistinguishable from denial. 20 years before, in 1919, Berlin was the capital of a defeated empire. The Kaiser was gone. The streets were full of veterans who had come home to nothing, no jobs, no money, no explanation for what they had just lived through. The city teetered on the edge of revolution. Gunfire in the streets, bodies in the canals. For a few terrifying weeks, nobody knew what Germany would become. What followed was the Weimar Republic, and with it, one of the strangest, most brilliant, most doomed experiments in modern urban history. Berlin in the 1920s became the city that the whole world watched. Artists from every country came here, scientists, philosophers. The cabarets were famous from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. The nightlife was unlike anything else on earth. And underneath all of it, underneath the brilliance and the excess and the freedom, was a city that was genuinely, desperately trying to forget how close it had come to collapse. Then came the hyperinflation, a wheelbarrow full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. People burning their savings for warmth because the paper was worth less than wood. Then the depression, then unemployment that swallowed entire neighborhoods whole. By the time 1933 arrived, by the time the regime came to power, Berlin had already been through more in 15 years than most cities see in a century. And that exhaustion, that collective weariness, that deep hunger for stability at any price, that is the thing you have to carry with you as you walk these reconstructed streets. Because it explains, better than anything else, how a city of 4 million educated, cultured, sophisticated people could look at what was happening around them and decide, again and again, to just keep going. Walk down Unter den Linden, the great boulevard at the heart of the city, and you see two worlds side by side. On one side, the State Library, the old palaces, the elegant stone facades that had stood for a century. On the other, flags. Red, white, black, enormous, every 50 meters. And always, at the edges, men in uniforms. Not threatening, exactly, just present, always present. What the AI reconstruction reveals, when we layer the historical photographs against the urban maps of the period, is how deliberately the regime had woven itself into the fabric of the city. It wasn't an occupation. It looked, from the outside, almost like decoration. And that was the most dangerous thing about it, because by 1939, many Berliners had simply stopped noticing the flags. The same way you stop noticing a billboard you pass every day on the way to work. The architecture of the city tells that story better than any history book. Stand in front of the Reich Chancellery on Wilhelmstrasse, the building where Hitler worked and lived, and what strikes you is not its menace, but its scale. And yet 2 streets away, a woman was hanging laundry from her window. A boy was kicking a football against a wall. A baker was pulling bread from an oven at 5 in the morning because that's what he did every morning, and the world outside his door had not yet given him a reason to stop. That is the Berlin you need to see. Not just the architecture of power, but the architecture of ordinary life existing in its shadow. But look more carefully at this city, and you begin to see what's missing. The jazz clubs that had made Berlin's nightlife famous across Europe in the 20s, gone or changed, or playing different music now. The bookshops still have books, but certain shelves are thin in a way that feels deliberate. And the faces, if you knew this city before 1933, you'd notice that some familiar faces are simply no longer here. 100,000 people had already left, most of them Jewish, or artists, or people who saw clearly what others were choosing not to see. By 1939, they were gone, and those who remained had made a choice, conscious or not, to keep going. One of those who stayed was Kathy Kollwitz, 72 years old, one of the greatest artists Germany had ever produced. The regime had stripped her of her professorship, banned her from exhibiting, made her invisible in the official culture of the city she had lived in for most of her life. And still she stayed, because Berlin was her city, because her studio was there, and her memories, and the graves of people she had loved. Where else do you go when the world has already ended once, and you are 72 years old? There was also Ruth Andreas Friedrich, journalist, quiet resistor, keeper of one of the most precise diaries of what it actually felt like to live inside this city during these years. In the back rooms of trusted friends, she and a small circle kept alive the things the regime was trying to erase. Books, music, the simple act of speaking honestly with another person. She wrote in her diary, "We live on a volcano, but we make lunch. We argue about small things. We laugh, because what else is there to do?" That question, what else is there to do, is the one that haunts every photograph from this period. Look at the reconstruction of the market at Schöneberg on a Saturday morning in 1939. The vendors arranging their fruit, the housewives comparing prices, the children running between the stalls. It looks completely, devastatingly normal. And it was. That's the point. That's the thing that the history of this city forces you to sit with. And then there was the city beneath the city, because not everyone had chosen silence. In apartments across Prenzlauer Berg and Kreuzberg and Schöneberg, small groups of people met in secret, not to plan revolutions, not to print pamphlets, but simply to listen to music that had been banned, to read books that had been burned, to speak out loud in a room full of people who trusted each other. It was a resistance built not of weapons, but of memory, of the stubborn insistence that the Berlin they had known, the open, strange, brilliant, chaotic Berlin of the 20s, had existed and still existed somewhere, even if only in the back of a darkened apartment on a Tuesday night. They called it inter-immigration. You couldn't leave the country, but you could leave, mentally, for a few hours. And sometimes a few hours was enough to come back the next morning and face another ordinary day in an unordinary city. When September 1st arrived, the radio announced it at 5:45 in the morning. Germany had invaded Poland. And the reaction on the streets of Berlin was not what Hitler expected, not what the propaganda had promised. There were no cheering crowds, no celebrations, no flags from apartment windows. There was silence, a heavy, knowing, terrified silence. An American journalist named William Shire was in the city that morning, and he wrote in his diary that the people on the streets were grim, silent, that it was nothing like 1914. No enthusiasm, no patriotic fever, just people standing at newspaper kiosks in the early morning light, reading the headlines and saying nothing, because this city had already lived through one world war. The people standing at those kiosks in September 1939, the older ones, the ones with gray in their hair, they knew what war actually looked like. Not the war of posters and parades. The other war. The one that came home in the bodies of young men and the silence of women who had stopped expecting letters. Berlin knew. Not everything. Not the full scale of what was coming. But enough to be quiet about it. Enough to go home that evening and hold their children a little longer than usual without quite being able to explain why. This is what the city looked like in those final months. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, its towers still whole against the skyline. The Romanisches Café, where writers had sat for decades debating everything and nothing. The old apartment blocks of Prenzlauer Berg, their courtyards full of the sound of someone practicing piano. The smell of bread and coal smoke and damp stone on a cold morning. All of it standing, all of it alive, all of it, in ways that nobody could yet calculate, already running out of time. In the years that followed, more than 80% of the city center would be destroyed, not in a single catastrophic moment. Night by night, block by block, in raids that the people in these photographs could not yet imagine. Streets they had walked every day of their lives would become unrecognizable. Buildings their grandparents had built would be gone in a single night. And the city that emerged from the rubble in 1945 would be so different from the one in these images that survivors would walk through their own neighborhoods and not know where they were. The same city that had been built slowly, over centuries, would be taken apart the same way. So when you look at these reconstructions, when you see the trams running and the flags hanging and the bakeries open at 6 in the morning, the question worth carrying with you is not how it ended. We know how it ended. The question is how people kept making lunch, how they kept laughing at small things, how 4 million human beings went about their lives inside something that was already, quietly, falling apart around them. The answer isn't comfortable. It isn't ideological. It's just human. They had rent to pay, children to feed, small joys they weren't ready to give up. And in that, not in the monsters, not in the ideology, not in the flags, is where the real history of this city lives. And this is where I stop, for now. Because before I decide where we go next, I want to hear from you. This city has years we haven't touched yet. 1940, when the war across Europe was exploding but Berlin was still functioning. 1943, when the nightly bombing raids began to change everything. 1945, when nothing remained but silence and rubble. And there are other cities waiting. London during the Blitz, Paris under occupation, Warsaw, which was literally erased from the map and rebuilt brick by brick from the memory of those who survived. Tell me in the comments, which year of Berlin do you want to see next? Or which city do you want me to reconstruct? If this video made you feel something, if for a moment you walked these streets and felt the weight of that silence in September 1939, leave a like. It tells me this is worth continuing. And if you want to be here when the next city comes to life, subscribe. It's free, and to me it means everything. I'll see you in the next reconstruction.